Hey guys, this is miicrow. I wanted to do an up-to-date guide on Tank SNS and Disruptor SNS because these are the two roles I play as a whole and the two that I'm best at and I'm kind of known for within the New World community. I haven't put out a video like this in a few months, so I feel like it's back time to revisit this while there's a little bit of downtime and explain where SNS is right now, what secondary you should be using, how you should be playing this, what gear you should be looking for, etc. And without further ado, let's start getting into it. So SNS as a whole has become dominant in terms of the region meta for NA, now EU, AP Southeast, and has been played on AP Southwest as well, from my understanding. Uh, just basically because of this effective HP that it gives to other people. It will effectively make you about 2.6 times tankier as an army as a whole, given all your buffs hitting. Realistically, you're not going to hit all your buffs at the same time, but it's pretty consistent to get off some of your buffs, and you will be like kind of minimum case if you're playing within an SNS aura, you're going to be 40% tankier. So that in turn with the big detonate meta where everyone is clumping up together, they're hitting each other really, really hard, makes SNS very, very strong because you have the ability to carry your army by effectively doubling and even like double and a half double of their effective HP with being like 2.5%. So it's just very, very meta for that reason alone. You can go shirking for it with this build, you can go aversion with this build. There's people that go both ways. It's sort of a preference depending on your playstyle, and a lot of the stuff is customizable to what you have. Just the weapon as a whole is very, very strong right now, and is strong because of the defensive formation that SNS gives. In terms of SNS offhands, basically every offhand in the game is viable with SNS to some degree in some game mode in some sense. So I tried to throw together a little bit of a table here to better compare what these offhands would be rated in certain situations. SNS is played as a tank, as a disruptor, and for utility with offhands, depending on what you're looking for. Depending on what you're looking for an offhand, it will dictate the playstyle. If you're playing for a pure util offhand like VG, you're not going to want to be on VG except for when you have time to be on VG. During an actual fight itself, VG will not help you at all. If you swap to VG, you are basically trying to kill yourself, so that's not worth going for. But in terms of other alts like an IG, that is very good to swap to in circumstances and go into the Ice Tomb and then come out of the Ice Tomb. So it's kind of a playstyle dependent upon that. In terms of where I'd run each one of these personally, Ice Gauntlet I think exceeds in close quarters conditions. OPR specifically, Ice Gauntlet is very, very strong for holding gates. It's also the best offhand, in my opinion, for SNS in the fort phase, both on attack and defense, because Ice Shower is able to get so much value in terms of controlling space. I Before, I think VG used to be the ult that people considered to have be like the most util overall, but I would say at the current moment, Ice Gauntlet is a little bit better than VG in terms of util, even though VG itself has like better util on paper, I guess. The reason being is the Oblivion from VG tends to not have as much impact as it had before. The Scream is a lot less impactful. You kind of have to hold it for certain situations. And Orb honestly feels like pad most of the time. You don't see it resulting in direct kills. So there is kind of a balance there between Ice Gauntlet and Void Gauntlet that's interesting, but I think Ice Gauntlet overall is the best weapon to go inside of fort circumstances and inside of circumstances where there are chokes in general, because that's where Ice Shower gets the most value. Warhammer is more of a OPR specialist. A secondary, in my opinion, I see a lot of people starting to bring Warhammer into wars. I personally don't see a lot of the impact that Warhammer has and tend to think it's bad, because if you miss with Warhammer, you're not going to effectively do anything. So even though it is a good secondary on paper, I think in when you actually look at the value it brings to a clump fight as a whole, it's relatively minimal, since you are usually surrounded by 13 to 15 Great Axe Warhammers anyway that also have a Warhammer, so you're not really bringing something else to the table that you could with another weapon that will allow your army as a whole to get more value in those clumps. But that being said, Warhammer as a base is a very strong weapon and is very good in clumps, which SNS tends to create clumps, so there is reason to be going Warhammer. The other circumstance for Warhammer is really, really interesting right now is weirdly with clear out, Warhammer tends to do fairly well. Because it can use the clear out to counter detonate pushes to a certain extent.
there is like assuming that you can actually see the detonate pushes, because there is kind of a weird bug slash setting that you could tune with that to make it a little bit easier to see those. But Warhammer is very good at countering those sort of pushes. Hatchet itself is kind of a not popularly used weapon at the moment, but I think with the PTR patch that's upcoming, it could be very good due to the social distance throw that is going to be causing a root to be occurring. So that is something to look out for. I don't think it's popular at the moment though. It's a decent offhand and OPR, but it is not as good as it was in that first PTR patch where it was giving you half your HP back every time you got below half HP. It is nowhere near as strong as it once was, but it's still decent at escaping situations that you won't be able to with other weapons, since you can't really spam dodge. With the SNS, you could use the social distance throw to generate some of that space that you need to live those detonate pushes at times. Greatsword is my general go-to weapon on an outside of fort. The main reason for that is it's able to group people up a little bit better together. And when those people are grouped up, you can tend to blow them up as an army. It's able to do this with a variety of trees depending on like what you're really looking for. But I think Greatsword in general tends to do very well in open space combat. But when the space gets tighter, Greatsword tends to get less value since a lot of the animations are surprisingly long and it's very easy to get caught during them, much like Spear. But Greatsword in general has a little bit better utility than Spear when it comes to clump situations, versus Spear excels a little bit more in the 1v1 sort of situation and is better as a disruptor as a whole right now. Great Axe is sort of a hybrid between Greatsword and Spear, like when I think about playing it. I think Great Axe is good as a secondary if you're a secondary SNS playing more of a disruptor role, but as a pure tank, I would generally not advise going for Great Axe, although it's not bad on paper and is a very well-rounded weapon. Has a lot of utility when it comes to that grab wall, has a lot of disruption potential with the right ability tree, and it has the potential to do a lot, and I think it's something that is very slept on, and sort of a heavy bruiser SNS role could very easily become popular if people decide to try it and if people decide to main it. But at the moment, there's not really a players that can play both the SNS and the Great Axe to a high level and juggle both at the same time. So it's something I don't think is popular now, but could be popular if more people kind of transition from that bruiser to SNS role and then try to fill that kind of knowledge gap in something that's very specific with this Great Axe secondary that I think is very possible to get a lot of value with. Spear, I would only consider as a disruptor at the moment. It's not awful as a tank if you think about Cyclone, but in practice, the animations are just too long to get consistent value. Spear does have a way in and out of clumps inherently and in very low cooldowns, which is a very interesting build weapon to build around. But as a whole, I would say Spear is generally a little bit weaker than other weapons that you could run. It's a very fun build to run, and it's very good as a disruptor with an SNS secondary as a tank to harass backlines. But other than that, I wouldn't really heavily consider Spear. Void Gauntlet is very, very good for inside fort situations and situations that you're winning. I think it's the best like win more weapon that you could have. So if you're in a spot where you're winning, you want to, and then you can kind of you don't have a lot of pressure on you. Void Gauntlet can get a lot of value with bruisers, but in spots where people are pushing you, putting a lot of pressure on you with Void Gauntlet, I find it very, very hard to live with this weapon. It's almost suicidal by the nature of not having a way out of clumps. It seems very, very difficult to live with it, and you are kind of in a predicament when you play it where if there's a clump coming at you, you can't actually shield the clump. You can't really do your job as an SNS and hold that shield so people don't die to that burst. And you end up having to like kind of be selfish when you use this weapon a lot more, which I think inherently makes it harder to play as a SNS secondary and generally makes it lower value. That being said, it's still a very, very good secondary. It's just not nearly as powerful as it once was. It's not the it can do everything. It increases your stam passively, so you can just tank everything all the time. That's gone now, so Void Gauntlet kind of feels like a shell of itself from an SNS perspective. Fire Staff is a very good in OPR. I'd say it's underrated as a tank weapon, but is something that you probably don't want your primary tank to be running. If you had like a secondary tank, I don't think Fire Staff is bad at all. The kind of Mimi Smolder Kitten setup is actually pretty good if you have a lot of Fire Staffs and you concentrate the damage at the right times, but requires so much coordination to pull off that often I don't find it to be completely worth it. But that being said, there is a lot of utility with that Smolder Kitten setup and a lot of potential with that I could see people starting to figure out how to get value with. It's just not a lot of people have explored that sort of setup as a whole right now. So Fire Staff is, I think, it remains very, very underrated, but is very strong as a whole. Okay, now I'm going to be getting into ability trees for all these weapons, starting off with the weapons I kind of favor the most. Of course, I have to start off with SNS and kind of go over that ability tree. This is kind of a more tank-oriented tree that I typically run, where you play for heavy attacks. Heavy attacks just inherently get value off the SNS, and that is just why you would kind of build towards that. You have to drop something on the right tree when you go for the setup with the heavy attack, so I often drop high grip since there's not a lot of range people that are actively trying to shoot an SNS, and if range people are trying to shoot an SNS, that just usually charges your refreshing ward, and they don't do significant damage, so it's sort of a waste of time for them, so I think this is a pretty easy perk to drop. And there's nothing else on here that you really want to consider dropping except for maybe one with the shield, but that's actually a lot of CDR when it comes down to practice. So I would run something like this when it comes to SNS as a pure tank. If you're playing more of a disruptor-oriented role, I don't find Defender's Resolve to be getting a ton of value. I tend to go for Leaping Strike. I don't go for the haste abilities, because if you go for the haste abilities, you have to not be swinging with your SNS to actually have the haste active, which I find to be inconsistent a lot of the times when you're playing this as a tank, even though you would think that would help you close the distance a bit more. So instead, I try to go for the slows on Cowardly Punishment, and I just play to harass slowed targets and kind of play as a pseudo tank, but also have that disruption oriented role when I play for that aspect. So that's kind of an alternative route that you can take depending on how you main the SNS itself. But the first tree is generally what I would say is better. In terms of moving on to a more DPS oriented tree, this would be like a DPS oriented tree that I go for, where you go for a heavy attack that gives you empower. You're basically at empower cap off of this alone because it's 30% empower, and then you can follow up with damage with opportunist. If you go for this sort of setup, usually you are trying not to take as many block passives, so you have to cut some of those. The defensive training, if you can get it, is really, really good, but it's kind of hard to actually get a slot for. I think if you want it, you can cut the one with the shield, and that kind of works for that pretty well as well. In terms of Ice Gauntlet, this is the standard pylon tree I would run. You notably don't go for Quick Frost, because if you're playing as a tank, any source of invigorated punishment damage on you is generally bad, and that is a source of extra damage that would be put upon you if you use that. So, and blocking stamina, I just take, because there's some times where you go for Ice Gauntlet, where you transition between Ice Gauntlet and SNS, where it kind of gets bugged, and you accidentally block with Ice Gauntlet, so it's kind of a savior mechanism. And the extra damage you get for something like Energizing Critical, I don't think is generally worth it with the setup. Pylon's really good defensively. It's really good at building ult charge right now. Something definitely not to take lightly. I think it's generally the Ice Gauntlet spec that I prefer. That being said, Ice Storm is also really, really good if you place the Ice Storms at the right times and you make sure not to overlap with people and instead place it on healers at the right times or in clumps where people are trying to get out where they don't have access to consistent heals. It can get a lot of value there too. And this is the setup I would run for that. In terms of Greatsword, this is my more defensive setup that I run with Steadfast Strike. You notably don't take Swift Onslaught because you're a tank, so you don't want those buffs that are on you all the time, but you take the buffs that you need in order to get Adaptive Rush. This playstyle in particular is kind of weird, where you go for a heavy attacks and then you kind of cancel those early to go for a rolling rupture as a pull, or you go for that and then you cancel early with relentless rush to kind of get catch people off guard and get value out of that being that onslaught stance, not always in that onslaught stance. That often can feel a little bit cumbersome. So if you want to try to go for something more easy to get value with, just take 1 point in a skyward slash just to proc that onslaught stance. Go for relentless rush, drop the rupture, and then switch off the weapon as a whole. And I think both trees are very viable as an SNS with a greatsword. In terms of Void Gauntlet, which I would consider to be like the next most viable weapon overall, these are all in order of like my viability. So SNS are obviously going to take. Ice Gauntlet I think is generally the best thing to go for. Greatsword is pretty good. Void Gauntlet is also pretty good, and this is the tree I would run with Void Gauntlet. There is an argument to go for Glimpse of the Void. That tree is kind of complicated, and it's something that you inherently can't get a lot of value off of SNS because you want to be switching off your Void Gauntlet a lot. So you can't actually consistently proc that, and the heavy attack if you miss it is super, super punishing. So in general, I would just go for this tree and stick with it. It's a lot more consistent. In terms of Great Axe, what I run with it, I am one of the people who actually cuts charge in this weird circumstance because you could use the SNS Leaping Strike when you go for this tree as a way to get out. So when you go for the Great Axe, then you can just use that to get out instead of charge. You could take Reap, and you could really, really harass people with this tree. It does surprisingly well in terms of damage and in terms of tankiness, and I think is in general really, really punishing to healers who don't know how to expect for this. This is my favorite build to run in OPR in general, but it is also just a pretty solid build overall. In terms of spear, I run this in a lot of West Wars. It's kind of a more fun build. Uh, Notably, you don't want to go for Cyclone, in my opinion, generally, because they're going to be using the spear as a disruptor. And usually, when you're playing for this build, your spear becomes your main hand because the cooldowns are so low. The SNS becomes your offhand, it's your escape tool, much like with Great Axe. And this is the tree I generally go with that. I don't take any of the bleeding perks because you can't consistently hit the same person over and over. It's not PvE, so I tend to cut for those and then take more of the utility perks on the left tree. In terms of what I would run with Warhammer, there's a argument for Armor Breaker. This is a sample Armor Breaker tree. There's also an argument for Clear Out. I think Clear Out is generally a little bit better than Armor Breaker at the moment, but when the PTR drops based off of what those changes look like, I think Armor Breaker will be good again. So both of them can be good, but I think in general the clear out is generally better, just specifically because we're in a detonate meta where people stack detonates and they rush on one target or like one area, and clear out can kind of soft counter that to a degree. And lastly, in terms of like a fire staff smolder kit and setup, a lot of people like to go for the fireball like tree. I think Incinerate's like weirdly good with SNS because people tend to group on you, so it's very easy to get consistent value out of Incinerate, and this is just a really easy way to build smolder stacks. It is noteworthy when you go for this, you want to be going for light attacks because those will stack smolder and not heavy attacks, which is why this tree is built this way. And also, if you dodge people, then it will put a smolder stack on them as well. So there's a lot of possibilities there to get those stacks up quickly. You could cash in those stacks first from Strike of the March and from Pyromania, and that will heavily increase your friendly fire staff's DPS on targets and will make people fall over a lot quicker than you would think. It's also a weirdly good build at getting kills. Usually when I play this build in OPR, I end up with 20 to 25 kills as a tank, which doesn't make a lot of sense, but it is just weirdly high value overall. And then lastly, in terms of Hatchet, I think this is generally the weakest secondary to go, but is viable to a degree. You want to get to Death Defy because it's just like an extra get out of jail free card. Use Berserk to kind of cleanse yourself of debuffs, and then use that social distancing to create space, and use the Infected Throw with Aerial and Transmission to get some value out of disease and weakens that you wouldn't have with other weapons. Going into the actual uh, setups themselves, as a tank SNS, you generally want as much con as possible, so usually people get to 500. It is very valuable to do like 450 con. It is not that big of a difference, to be honest, or something less than that just to get the perks that you want. But you want as much con as possible. Generally, Bile, Firestorm, and Healing Stoneform are the best ults to go for. I think Bile and Firestorm are the two most popular ults. The reason why people don't go for Vines with SNS is because it will make it so that you generate your stam less fast, and stamina is really important to be able to tank as an SNS. So you kind of can't go for that. So Bile can work out very well, but you have to be very wary of Maelstorms, which could eat the Bile. And then Firestorm is something that can remove dots on you and in general just pump out a large amount of util. In terms of gear that you want, usually you want 5 Resil, 5 Shuriken 4 Elemental Aversion. This is a preference. I think the two best SNSs in NA between NA, like Lengod and Lengod prefers Shuriken 4, I prefer Elemental Aversion. I think it's completely preference. It does not really matter which one that you're looking for. And then you want the weapon perks that you need. There are uh, the PvP block perk. I forget the name off the top of my head. You want Shield Rush, and then you want a Fortify, or you want a Ward. You don't want this Sturdy. I think this is Sturdy Fort is the PvP perk, but that's what you want for that. Jumping to Sword, you want Trenchant, Brand, Plague Strikes, and something like Chain on there, ideally. The main idea behind this is you go for heavy attacks, you apply your a disease, you apply a rend, and you cleanse a buff on yourself. So that turns out to be a lot of utility packed in heavy attacks, which is why a lot of times if you look at my VODs, I am just spamming heavy attacks. Sword also has the quickest heavy attack animation out of any weapon in the game, I believe, except for Greatsword and Onslaught, but I'm not 100% sure on that. But before Greatsword came out, it had the fastest heavy attack animation in the game, so you can capitalize on that with this sort of setup. In terms of what you want on your amulet, I tend to drop health a lot. There are a lot of people that like health. I don't think you need 21k HP to live. I think 19k HP is fine. And then it's like usually like 19.5. And then on top of that, you get the divine, so the more heals will be incoming to you. So it actually increases your effective HP overall if you are constantly, or if you're consistently in the heal area, which you should be as an SNS because AoE healers should be pumping heals on you. So I think this actually ends up being a little bit more effective HP, weirdly, just based off the group setup that you have. On Ring, I like to go Refreshing Ward and Enfeebling. On Earring, I like to go Regenerating and Refreshing Ward. I think you only need 2 to 3 Refreshing Ward to actually get a lot of value out of SNS, which is a little bit weird. And in terms of like other perks that you want on your gear, uh, the combination of Freedom, Refreshing Ward, Flame Conditioning, and Invigorated, I think are all viable. I'm the only person I think that actually likes Invigorated on SNS, and it is completely because people like to solo bio me and solo scream me, and I don't like being diseased all the time, and I am selfish, and I could outplay Warhammer stuns, I could outplay detonate pushes to a degree, but you cannot really outplay being diseased all the time. So that's just like a soft way for me to counter that. It also gets the runs off me, which just is kind of nice, and it gets the exhaust off me as well, which helps me generate my stam. But I think there's an argument to be running any one of these, and it does not really matter which one you go. It's all kind of a preference to a degree. In terms of playing as a disruptor, usually you drop your con to 300. The ults change a bit. Firestorm isn't as good as a disruptor as some of these other ultimates. It's not very good offensively. It's more of a defensive ult. And then the gear remains pretty much the same and overall, but the main thing is that you want to be dropping your con a little bit with that setup. In terms of like play styles as SNS, if you're playing as a tank as SNS, you generally want to be maximizing the time that you actually hold your shield. There are some little known tricks as a tank that can help you out a lot. For example, when clumps are crashing, if you use a dot rune glass gem in your sword, you can actually activate the Invigorating Bulwark perk as a dot over time with Shield Bash and with Shield Rush, which makes it so that you get 60 stamina over the duration of the dot. So like every second, I believe you get 15 more stamina. So that's just a really good mechanism to make it so that you can regenerate your stamina mid-fight if you time those abilities correctly, as well as turning your back to clump and in general playing so that people could damage your HP bar, but they can't damage your stamina tends to get a lot of value as well. Because then you maximize that defensive formation uptime, and defensive formation is what makes people live. So in general with SNS, you want to be protecting your stam bar more than you want to be protecting your HP, which is counterintuitive until you play the role, and then will start to make a little bit more sense. The other thing too is you can do half heavies. Half heavies can apply some of these heavy attack perks. I don't believe they apply all of them, but it applies Plague Strikes for sure. I'm not 100% sure about Frank Justice because that's a little bit harder to test, but that is something that's very useful, and it's an even quicker animation. And then lastly, the Achilles heel is really, really good as playing as a pseudo disruptor, even with 500 con, and can really force cooldowns early. There's a lot of circumstances in wars where I could force healers to use stone form for no particular reason, just because they don't like to be slowed when there's other people in the area that are looking at them, because they're afraid that I'm setting them up to be killed by someone else, because I can go from a slow into a stun, and then someone else could potentially one-shot them. So they're very wary of that, and people try to play around that. So as SNS as a whole, from a tank, those are some tricks that can help you. As a disruptor, like I talked about earlier, holding this leaping strike as a passive to kind of get out, I think tends to work very well. And as a disruptor, generally the way I think about it is when I am not on SNS, I am looking to do damage. When I'm on SNS, I'm looking to live. There is a little bit of overlap there as well. Like when you're using, you could use abilities on SNS to kind of help your other weapon do a little bit better. SNS doesn't have bad damage either, but the problem is if you're running SNS in heavy with a shield that is purely defensive, you're not going to do as much damage with the SNS as you would with another weapon, which is why I play for that playstyle that way. With that being said, guys, let me know if you have any other specific questions about SNS. I stream pretty much every day now on Twitch with SNS kind of related videos slash gameplay, as well as some other tank-oriented roles and some other fun builds if you guys want to check that out. And I will see you guys in the next video.
Hey guys, this is miicrow. I just wanted to throw in an example of actually like how to do the gear setup because a lot of that video is very abstract. So in terms of like how I set up my gear right now, I have 4 different gear slots unlocked. This is just from watching random things, but the way I've set it up is I have a lot of weapon perks that are on my actual weapons themselves, which makes swapping between sets very, very easily. I only have to swap one piece of gear, which is my chest piece, I believe usually, but it depends a little bit on the specific set. And then from there, it's just very, very easy to swap things in and out. So for something like a great sword, I like to run transference because this is a refreshing word on it. It's a farmable drop. And then I go my LA version resil. I throw Invig on there. Got my weapon perk here that I need. Uh, you got amulet, you got ring, you got teardrop here, and then depending on the setup, I'll have enfeebling, which enfeebling should be on the setup, but it was not for some reason, or I'll run invigorated punishment for something like a VG, but it doesn't really matter. The weekend is just very, very good, but I just don't like running a tech 10 dex ring all the time, but that was the cheap one I got. So that's what I do for that kind of setup. The weapon perks, it kind of depends on the weapon. Ice Gauntlet, you don't really need anything except Deadly Frost. So you can just throw that on your weapon itself. Something like VG, you kind of want the Oblivion, so you need that piece. Something like Greatsword, you need the Relentless Freedom, so I throw that on the piece. And then something like Spear, you don't really need anything except for the Enfeebling on the Spear itself. So you have to build something out kind of like that, and I'd recommend having multiple of these because there's a lot of times in the war where you want to swap between these sets. And you'll see me if you watch on Twitch at all, where I swap between these sets a lot during wars, depending on how I'm feeling. And yeah, if you guys have any questions, feel free to leave a comment or reach out on Discord, and I'll see you guys in the next video.